Hello everyone, today we talk about the Tudor strategy for the defense of England and actually the broader possessions in the British archipelago against different enemies. We'll start from Henry VII, so mostly the threat that, as we will see now, had substantiated like most English effort was coming from France, right? Then this mini-series is about the English strategic planning in function of the defense from the Spanish Armada. But as we've seen also for the video on the Spanish planning for the English invasion, much of the two contendants' strategic posture derived from not just politics in general, but also from the military experience matured in the previous generations about mostly naval and or amphibious warfare, right? So it's important to focus on where the English were by 1588 in terms of that experience, how they defended their half island, because of course there was always the ineliminable problem of Scotland that could have served as a gateway for French or Spanish invasion, and developed their own navy, mostly as the best defense, right, for their possessions, and also the coastal fortifications, how the land armies functioned, right, in this broader system, and it's surely fascinating. And it can be even argued that all Tudor history was a sort of preparation for the Great War with Spain that finally began in 1585, right? There are things that had accelerated from a while, especially under Elizabeth's reign, because Mary and Edward had not been so sensitive towards the fleet, right? That had required a specific insight for further development. Elizabethan warfare, and this is valid for naval as much as land forces, and I made a couple of videos here and there about the period. We looked at the trained bands, the Tudor trained bands, also something about, well, in that case was Tudor cavalry, but observing how in the second half of the 16th century England had began to fall behind, at least in terms of land forces, to most European powers. This was an issue because the entire point of defending the island at sea was the awareness that the English land forces weren't that much compared to the French, the Spanish, and their German and Italian troops combined. So this was an enormous issue which struck deeply until the end. Ireland was a hell of a problem because it was also exposed. It could be a secondary theater from which even launching an operation. Scotland was actually the greatest problem, as we already pointed out. And all these reflections had been tormenting the Tudors from quite a while, for at least a century before, right? It's obvious that at the end of the Wars of the Roses, other things had been going on in Europe, namely the Italian Wars, during which, in fact, there was, as we will see now, at least a couple of serious French attempts to invade England. The rise of Spain as at least in all the Habsburgic possession, mostly centered in this greater sum by that point of three Iberian kingdoms, dynastical, plus all the American territories where the English were also skirmishing against the Spanish, had definitely an incredible power, summed with the one of the empire. The German Italian estates, especially after the Habsburgic victory in the Italian wars, right? And so this dramatic strengthening of also the Spanish position in the Netherlands, in spite of the recent revolt So all things we observed in the previous video about the Spanish planning. Plus, of course, we have to consider the religious background, the Reformation, the obvious position of Elizabeth by that point, right? In support of the Protestant cause, even though she wasn't probably very much into it in a personal sense, but it was about her kingdom and country, which at that point laid in this very delicate balance of supporting the Dutch against the Spanish, averting this potential threats to Britain as a possible invasion, also from the north, through the north, and of course the build-up of a maritime power, which definitely began in the Tudor era. Right, all say at least the main Tudor monarchs showed a strikingly advanced under awareness, at least, for the growth of this English seaborne power. Right, of course, this was very far from imagining what Britain would have become in a couple of hundred years, but it surely laid the bricks for that to happen in the first place. This care was reflected in the emergence of fairly primitive, because again, England was, after the 100 Years' War, fundamentally lagging behind most continental achievements, but let's say still self-sufficient. This was very important. Domestic armaments industry, right? The Habsburgs had all these enormous territories, but with all the power that they could derive from it, but also the nuisances, right? The lack of, we've seen also in the Spanish plan, of the coordination between the governor of the Netherlands and the Spanish kingdom. Did say that all the complications of an incredibly and also more easily shatterable system to at least temporary hits, right? That at least a country, doesn't matter how contained, that relies solely on its own resources, and yes, some other, think about the Lordship of Ireland and other possessions overseas already, also in France, that were strategically significant, even as individual strongholds, really favored in relative terms instead this unitary policy. This was especially true for a domestic armaments industry, for example, a well-developed merchant marine, and an English financial community, which were all equal to the demanding task of prosecuting the major war, right, dragged on from 1585 to 1604. As it would prove, but that throughout the previous century had not to be given for granted in the actual accomplishment in reach. Right here, as you know, the struggle, as always, especially in the larger engagements, sees balance odds. Right, the Spanish didn't have this overwhelming, crushing superiority on the English, exactly because, especially at sea, the latter had been developing all these impressive capacities. It was understood definitely as a broader. We could digress on this, like when is that English mindset switch from, say, dreams of feudal dynastic struggle for the French monarchy in a still what could resonate as an Angevin legacy to the actual modern, we can call kind of modern age kind of political and national resurgence, as especially as a seaborne power, right? Lots of factors had just obliged the English to do so, but as historians, I think it's important to insist on the mindset, right? At least the Anglosphere insists on the concept that the Reformation, somehow even the primitiveness of England, surely the autonomy, especially from the church, and the firm control of counter-reformation, etc., had encouraged, had facilitated the spread, for example, of more technical, scientific teachings, also for commoners that maybe didn't know even how to read, but understood numbers, spent their lives at sea, and that brought, definitely, this is eventually even a contrast, because there were some ideas that were quite subversive. Again, the same, say, the English monarchy in its Protestantism for a long time wasn't particularly passionate from an ideological point of view towards the most innovative political ideas. I mean, in the following centuries, they had a monarch beheaded because of such struggle, and interestingly enough, around something called ship money, right? That did have to do with, in fact, the pursuit of such more kind of expansive, but especially maritime, seaborne direction. And it's almost paradoxical, because, as you know, at the end of the English Civil War, say at the end, after the Second Revolution, the Glorious Revolution, Britain paid like 10 times more, whatever was required, from the ship money of Charles I. So it's this tension between the estates, the cultures, the mindsets involved in the political, institutional culture, of course, also the confessional one, etc. So it's too much of a deal to observe. But that sense, at least, of entrepreneurship, of let's say, of just an offensive, an active attitude towards international policy, especially for a country that doesn't have many other directions to expand but the sea, in a time of the great explorations and the foundation of colonial empires, was, a key dynamic to observe here. In all this, the nucleus of a royal navy, eventually, as we will see now, supplemented by other also mercantile vessels, support, etc., hired from the civilians, left to Elizabeth's Tudor ancestors, grew into the margin of victory in the struggle with Spain. There were several, only to that, but it constituted a very large part, right, of English success. Now, the precedents of Tudor naval employment were, as we said, crucial in the development of English plans to oppose the assembling First Spanish Armada. The founder of the Tudor dynasty, Henry VII, who reigned between 1485 to 1509, had understood the importance of an effective fleet, and he had thus created a small permanent Royal Navy. This, from still a sort of medieval perspective, background, mindset, is quite important, because normally during the Middle Ages there wasn't such a thing like a permanent navy. Especially these great larger countries, feudal monarchies in Western Europe, had surely developed a core of forces, but it cost a lot, right? And up to the age of exploration, there hadn't been much of a need to maintain a royal navy constantly operating. They would normally hire, say, the maritime republics forces on that occasion, because they were just readily available, very high quality, and didn't entail the costs of maintenance, at least on the longer term, nor of shipbuilding, etc. So gradually, the importance of such instrument had emerged. I made a video about the Castilian fleet, how it began, like in the late Middle Ages. If you're interested in that, you can find a video. In any case, the English nucleus at the time of Henry VII consisted of 5 warships. We're talking about the end of his reign, the beginning of the 16th century. 2 of these ships, the Regent and Sovereign, were very updated, among the best in Europe at the time. And this is in fact a characteristic of first half of the 16th century Tudor Navy. It was quite updated, especially under Henry VIII. As we will see now, the English fleet was really remarkable. It's mostly in the second half of the century things began to worsen, right, and only a decisive turn under Elizabeth and the favoring of specific figures also in naval engineering and strategic ideas, right, of sort of a specific posture, just as a naval power would revive. Bear in mind that all this was very costly, right? So it wasn't about just, we found out that the best thing we can do is building ships, so it's easy, let's just build ships and we're cool. No, all of this came through a very harsh political phase, the Anglican schism, all the issues, the financial issues related to it, the threats, of course, that were posed to England, also as a consequence of that, and say all that pressure that derived just from not backing down, from already depleted, let's say, strategic assets since the 15th century. So it's actually a pretty tense situation all the time. Equally important, Henry VII had developed the practice of supplementing his own force with hired merchant ships in times of crisis. It wouldn't be until the early 16th century that Sweden began, as a kingdom, to first build ships specifically designed for war as entirely different types separated from the civilian use, right? Throughout the Middle Ages, there had been, of course, such separation gradually, but certain merchantmen could simply act as warships in case of need. There was a gradual refinement, of course, of naval engineering, maritime culture, coming from also, and especially these emergent powers that had more, say, at some point when we have sort of tabula rasa, you can start updating in a more modern ways since that beginning, right, as opposed to greater powers that still have a lot of structure dating to previous times that is more difficult to update to a degree. To facilitate fleet mobilizations, Henry VII had developed Portsmouth as a major naval base that was completed with the Royal Navy's first dry dock. Portsmouth was well situated, especially for supporting the short-range English ships operating at the western end of the channel, right? It's longitudinally at the same level of the Cottontown Peninsula, so there you have sort of straight compared with the previous straits, especially on the French coast, and it would thus serve to operate in this more distant surface of water from the main bases of the English forces in the Medway and Thames estuary, obviously. The Medway and Thames bases were also improved, naturally, in the process. Arsenals were built at Greenwich and Woolwich. And of course, bear in mind that a naval activity here was not just an end to itself. It had to consider the prevention of a landing, which naturally would have more preferably occurred from an English enemy's perspective on the south or the east of Britain, right? So this this entailed still that the western part of England was, yes, more susceptible to, say, enemy exposure, but it didn't serve also the enemy's interests logistically so much as the southeast, right, just facing the Netherlands, where in fact the main imperial plans, as we've seen, of the invasion of England had been revolving around, right? So London, the Thames mouth, etc. It's all about the power in the kingdom, right? You take that, and basically the rest is relatively smooth sailing, or actually smooth walking, right, across the country at that point. In any case, you see how already under Henry VII, the result of such measures was that England gained the capacity for fleet mobilization that was rapid in comparison with any foreseeable continental antagonist. In other words, for the purpose of defending especially London and the more productive areas of England, the monarchy had the capacity of putting together a sizable naval force from this very places and withstanding an enemy attack. Henry VIII, reigning between 1509 and 1547, expanded his father's still modest beginning into a truly powerful standing fleet. Right. Again, here the threats are enlarging, are ever more visible. Right. The English Royal Navy alone, under Henry VIII, numbered 53 ships in 1547, of which 25 were 200 tons or larger, for a total of Royal Navy vessels in 1547 amounting to 11,268 tons. The reign of Henry VIII was also remarkable for the aforementioned spirit of innovation and development which the Navy benefited particularly from. Consider also the doctrinal issues here. England had never handled such a large royal navy before. This was also a moment of relatively rapid change in naval engineering technology, so that the English experimented a little with especially the typologies of ships available for building their fleet. Galleasses, that is, propelled by both oars and sail, were, for example, tested but abandoned. Right, the naval artillery of Henry VII's reign, typically anti-personnel serpentines firing only a quarter-pound ball, appeared to be anachronistic. Now, it was replaced also thanks to, as we've seen, the greater tonnage that maintained a greater stability of the ship when firing, by heavier guns sighted lower in the hull. Construction and repair yards were, of course, also established at Woolwich and Deptford in the Thames estuary. So also in an area that you had to really enter in and being exposed, as we will see now, to an important amount of coastal fortifications in order to just damage, right? And of course, activity was, as we will see now, intense, and such repairs were quite important to be delivered quickly to the existing vessels. Plus, also the one building new ones. Henry VIII used his fleet aggressively. This was also a hallmark of strategic insight, right? He employed the Royal Navy mostly to convoy his armies to France, right? And this was still the main purpose of fleets. Historically, just was changing at this point, something a bit more active in a more extensive naval operational capacity. Just after Henry VIII's death, the Royal Navy was used to support operations in Scotland too, because of the old alliance between the French and the northern neighbors. Now, in 1539, Henry VIII's impressive mobilization of 150 warships stands out. Right, this was a very important display of power, working as a deterrent factor against a joint Franco-Spanish invasion project. The premise that the fleet at sea is the first best line of defense was already deeply ingrained by this point in English history. The importance of the fleet was recognized even as Henry made significant improvements in the second line of defenses, those ashore, known as the device force, right? That can be still admired. Some of them were also implemented on later times. Some are even probably modern, contemporary coastal bases, of course, readapted, but on the basis of such strongholds. Right, during Henry VIII's reign, there was this energetic program of fortification all along England's southern and eastern coasts, I was saying before, because, again, landing there made everything much easier in terms of severing, especially the main lines, for example, between, say, York and London, would threaten the capital, etc. The West was more rugged, also more complicated to operate, and there were less resources for the invaders, etc. So this areas, this coastline here was instead way more important. Batteries were sited to deny a hostile invasion, force access to sheltered English harbors. These new defenses had innovative Renaissance design. They were solid, low-profile structures designed to withstand heavy naval bombardment, right? And also capable of defense against landward attack, as they would occur, as we will see now. In other words, you needed this sturdy turtle capable of gunning back at the major fleets and landing forces, supporting, of course, the action of a land army, because, of course, any fortification, if not manned and support alone, doesn't really do much. It just stays there to be outflanked and circled. So they were obviously supporting structures, and especially firepower over considerable amount of very strategic, at least, coastlines, beaches, and so on. Is the flat lands that exist, in fact, in the southeast of the English sea line. And in addition, the home defense forces were organized accordingly. During the invasion scare of 1539 from France, for example, the English levies of the southern and southeastern shores were mustered and armed. Right, it was something, reminiscent of Alfred the Great's boroughs, and I don't think that's actually that distant. Right, the concept of a local militia here that is to defend the shores that is also dispensed from outer service, right, on a longer distance, right, whether on land or at sea, is part of how just the local communities had organized themselves. And now, of course, there was all a problem. We'll see perhaps better in another bit about their providing them with the means to do so, with the training, with especially the collective one, but also the armament, given that technology was becoming ever more expensive. And all this had to work as a first say an absorbing force that would have both the necessary time for a land army at least to identify where the enemy had tried to land, and like coming on them. The objective was preventing them from landing in the first place, and or doing so while they were still occupied during the operation itself. But of course things could go in a different way, and armies can't be just everywhere immediately for that. So that's why also this patrolling, etc., was quite relevant. Watchtowers, etc. You have other forces under the Duke of Norfolk called out to cover the northern frontier as well against possible Scottish intervention, which again was the greatest headache in that moment, right? Either a Scottish invasion or just a Scottish support to the invasion through their own ports, that would have given the necessary time to just land this, larger forces capable of crushing the English land ones, and simply marching on London. A more serious invasion threat was mounted against England in 1545 during Henry VIII's Third War with France. This was a big deal. The French fleet was concentrated at Le Havre and in the Seine estuary. Naturally, these movements were reported. There was no secrecy when you look at this big expeditions. You'll see now you're warned at least months in advance. The French fleet included 25 galleys brought around from the Mediterranean and over 150,000 sails. Do not discard simply the galleys because, they have a smaller draft, of course, than the other ships normally, and there were instances of low backdrop where these ships would be used successfully through the 18th century. Look at Peter the Great against Sweden, for example. So especially in the Thames estuary and on other, again, low backdrop coastline, they could operate in quite interesting ways. However, the numerical proportion involved here tells you how, of course, sail ships had the upper hand. Consider also that in war, it's also a matter of quantity, right? Whatever you can put together, if you can sustain that operationally, logistically, etc., does, right? So just a galley per se is still an offensive, functional offensive weapon, right, at the time. The French army of invasion counted 50,000, which is really big for the time being, and it would have posed a very serious problem to the hopes of English resistance if landed and assembled properly on British soil. This army was assembled near the fleet while another French army was besieging the English garrison of Boulogne, so in France. The English, of course, maintained Calais up to 1558. We will see it now. I made a video about the Battle of Gravelines just recently, in the prodromes of which, in fact, Calais was lost because it was not garrisoned properly. That comes a bit of as a major deal for Mary, to Queen Mary at the time, who was incredibly embittered by the loss of Calais. That really meant a lot for the English, if you think about it in historical perspective, all the 100 years of war and before. This army was assembled near the fleet. The French plans were very articulate and also included a separate landing in Scotland by 3,000 French troops under the command of the Count of Montgomery. The main French fleet and landing force were, however, to first seize the Isle of Wight, and then the English naval base at Portsmouth, destroy the half of the English fleet stationed there, and then blockade the English-held Boulogne and Calais from the sea, so at least securing the control over such strongholds and de facto expelling the English from France. In all this, of course, were, as we will see, landings in England planned altogether. The English, in the best of the outcomes, the English response in 1545 was coherent, effective, like a fleet of 80 sail was assembled in Portsmouth under the Lord Admiral Lille, Charles Brandon, the first Duke of Suffolk, and son-in-law to the same king, because after the death of Louis XII, Mary Tudor, not the daughter, but the sister of the modern sister of Henry VIII, had married him. There was a whole story behind this, but still, this was a hell of a command. So Lille was in command of this 80 sail fleet, while another one of 60 sail took position even further west along the English coast at Plymouth. Now, at this point, it's important to observe that the French force was still superior, right? As long as, the forces were concentrated. So this aspect is important because, as we will see now, there was a defensive, a counter-offensive purpose from the English side, and until the French backed down, fundamentally passing to counterattack was complicated, because the French did manage to land forces. On the occasion, Henry VIII's line coastal fortifications was manned and supplied. Behind it were 4 field armies gathered. In East Anglia, the south, the west, and towards Scotland. Right, so these forces were just a couple were just nearby. The other 2 were to remain in reserve and to cope with, especially the Scottish border, that, as we've seen, would have regurgitated French forces, external French forces plus the Scottish allies. The landing in the north would have been successful as just, however, a secondary front anyway, considering the army unmasked by the French. There were plans naturally for the concentration of such English field armies, primarily against the landing in the south, because that was the main theater, and there is also a concept of reserve. You can't quite spend all your forces at once, but you have also to be quick in outpowering the enemy locally, right? And especially during the landing. That is one of the most delicate and kind of risky operations, together with, say, any crossing, fundamentally. Regarding the aforementioned superiority on a local base, it's very important to observe that in the same 1545, Lille had attempted with entire English forces to disperse the French fleet while it was still in the Seine, right? And this action was foiled by the onset of bad weather, right? But it would be, just from a moral, strategical, and operational point of view, an incredibly important precedent for the English war against the Armada beginning in 1585, right? Because it really had showed that England was all paired with such an enormous power like France in naval matters, right? And could even offend properly, not just merely defend the country, right? But even attempting the destruction of an enemy fleet before they would reach the island in the first place. So after the aforementioned raid on the Seine failed, Lille refused battle with the French fleet in the Channel, right? Because it was too risky, objectively, to just send, say, the objective of striking in the Seine was, of course, thought to be achieved through surprise, right, and essentially an unprepared enemy. But when the French sailed forth, it was a gamble. It was essentially a 1-to-1 to at that point. And if the English had lost, the French had a crushing land force to invade England, and then the risk would have been defeating also them on land, because it would have meant, in case of defeat, the end practically of the Tudor there. Whereas even a French defeat at sea would have not cost France, right? So this showed, aside from the fleets, that what was the strategic disproportion, at least between the two countries at the time, right? It did all pass through the fleet. The French elected not to force their way past Portsmouth's defenses, because they also, of course, had lots of complications and concerns regarding this massive plan. And things get complicated the larger your forces are, and you can have disproportionate losses even for relatively a minor decision, right? So you're very wary and careful. The French made some attempt to land on the Isle of Wight that the local English levies defeated, however, which tells you how, of course, complicated the landing operations really were, in spite of the crushing force that naturally the French had towards the island's garrison. There was another brief French landing further east on the English coast at Seaford. The combined English fleets at that point were skirmishing with the French, one not to engage it openly, right, but wearing it out in that situation. And the French essentially decided to withdraw for many reasons, because it was, again, operationally very complicated to find the right spot. If you exposed yourself to the landing, right, pretty serious issues could going on. Plus, there was the plague raging on board, because, as we'll see, this was a concern also of the English, that improved what was the general level of ships overload during this kind of operation, even just for the average crew, not just for the embarked soldier in case of landing. This averted fundamentally the English threat, the threat to England. The English fleet then chased the French one. Also, they poured supplies and reinforcements into the besieged Boulogne, as well as in Calais, which thus could not be taken by the French. That's how the 1545 invasion was averted. The only part of the French plan which actually succeeded was Montgomery's landing on the west coast of Scotland, which did prove again that dangerous if the French landing in the south had succeeded as well, proved that Scotland would be viable for this kind of operations for the English enemies. Montgomery's ships had slipped through the Irish Sea, while the two English fleets were essentially watching the French invasion preparations in Normandy. To go after Montgomery would have not been an English interest because, say, the 3,000 men in Scotland were still, again, a secondary force, and the greatest threat, as we've seen, came from the south. But it was just exposing how easy it was for a Continental to just reach Scotland, right, bypassing English forces when pinned down by a larger one coming directly from, off the, say, the coast in the face of England herself. In the same way, Montgomery, by the way, could have landed in Ireland, which was a quite troubled land, especially because of the national and Catholic resistance against the Tudor. I made a video about the lordship of Ireland, at least for the medieval background to that. The need to cover the long intended coastlines of both Ireland and Scotland, illustrated by Montgomery's expedition and a few other attempts, added immensely to the practical political issues of Elizabeth and her advisors in the 80s, especially of the 16th century, because everybody knew at that point that the sailing was possible, that the English could again have that hell of a navy, but still not managing to cover this quite extended coastline, which is a big deal in of itself. Like, if you consider, like, this is true for other countries in Europe, the very extended coastline, think about the Italians against the Ottomans, etc. If you count of all the coastline just extensively and the people who live there that you have to cover for these thousands of kilometers, that's an enormous coast, right? It obviously leaves certain areas uncovered. It involves, as we've seen, an important contribution from the local communities through militias, and generally speaking, this psychologically, morally, right? That affects, of course, strategy a lot, right? The fact that we are exposed, we are vulnerable, right? These people can invade at some point. This is a huge deal, motivationally and beyond. So the brief reigns of Henry VIII's young son Edward VI, 1547-1553. The guy died a teenager still, and Henry's daughter Mary, 1553-1558, are remarkable for the decline, actually, of the English Royal Navy, which occurred for different reasons. Now we don't have time to stress. Of course, there was not a self-sabotage, but say Mary's marriage with the King of Spain was, say, not surely a disadvantage for the same widow, Philip II, decades later, when invading the same England. So the sense that, of course, there were also other troubles internally, this instability due to the relatively quick succession, etc. That and the especially the religious switch, first the intensively Protestant policy of James, and then the Catholic restoration of Mary, and then the Protestant re-establishment of Elizabeth did create some conditions that had led specifically the royal ships rotting away, because that was the problem. This stuff had to be upkept, and it required constant funding, as we were saying at the beginning. At the end of Mary Tudor's reign, there were only 26 royal ships, less than half her father's 53, plus many on the list were actually rotting. Right, Royal Navy tonnage by 1558 had slipped to 7,110, so 35% less than at Henry VIII's death. Right, and the culmination of this period of neglect from 1547 to 1558 was definitely the English loss of Calais, the last English continental possession in the winter of 57-58. When the French suddenly besieged and took Calais in January 1558, England had not been able to reinforce the city because of the lack of a fleet, so no troops nor supplies could be replenished there in time. And it was really grim, right? It was very easy for the French to take the city, right? It was almost ridiculous in the sense that Calais had exactly embodied the last stronghold of the resistance that had remained there, in spite of all, and instead it was taken that simple. Elizabeth I, who, as you know, reigned between 1558 and 1603, succeeded Mary, her half-sister, and almost 30 years of her reign had passed before the approach of the First Spanish Armada in 1588. So these early decades of Elizabeth's reign would be dramatically productive, and surely made the difference for the English victory in 1588, thanks to the founding, and not only, right, also the different attitude, different mindset towards the Royal Navy. Plus, Elizabeth was quite conservative, also because she didn't have much money to spend in the first place, but she was, of course, far-seeing when leaving, as we will see now, some men in charge of the fleet with their innovative ideas and sense of also boldness that in that circumstance would prove tremendously successful in the end. Development of the English Navy provided Elizabeth with an efficient tool that significantly broadened also her strategic options in the 80s of the 16th century. Improvement of the poorly maintained ships which Elizabeth inherited was the responsibility of her 5-member Navy board from 1558 to the mid-70s of the 16th century. This conservative group, however, did a little more than purchase a few new ships. There was a dramatic lack of vision. The board believed essentially in a coastal waters navy executing brief missions close to its bases of supply, because resources were limited, of course, but also these men were not providing with the alternative, the options, the advantages that a more far-sighted naval policy would have surely proven to be available in potential. For that role, the Navy Board believed essentially England needed more ships of the conventional type that at the time were shorter and rounder with high structures fore and aft, right, heavily manned. So definitely not agile, say, fast maneuvering, aggressively performing, sort of castles on water, right? So they would be mostly short range because large crews rapidly consumed rations as well, and these fleets were reflecting sort of the passivity and the defensivism of these individuals' policy and strategy, that just per se is detrimental because it's just leaving the enemy the initiative, right? It may be, of course, some of these people didn't know better, but let's say in a military sense, just counting on a navy that has to just defend, even at short range, etc. It can work. I mean, short range means, yes, you can do what Lille did back in the day. But again, naval warfare was rapidly accelerating. Naval engineering, naval technology provided with greater means that some Englishmen were, however, experimenting autonomously, and that's why what we were saying at the beginning about the private initiative, entrepreneurship, autonomy, that sometimes was also cultural to a degree. These were the most, let's say, inclined, not necessarily pro-Protestant, but definitely that element that would have eventually, say, in insight as a legacy overthrown the monarchy in the mid 17th century, etc. That we're looking at of course, the income, the earns, the advantages of all what was opening to the Europeans in the New World, especially in the case of the English, and that were characterized by, of course, complete lack of scruple, incredible aggressiveness. So everything that you need for an effective and pioneeristic military, because this is also what these men were. They were younger Englishmen, by the way, with even revolutionary new ideas. Not just about naval warfare, as we were saying, bold, young, hungry, sometimes angry, as you understand, and that, however, knew pretty well what war at sea was about. They definitely had an idea of what the best ship's design, as well as naval strategy, would have had to be. We're talking about individuals like John Hawkins of Plymouth, the same locality, of course, of the naval base, son of a wealthy Plymouth merchant, right? That thus, was all one with that evidence. Like, what are these ships doing here? What could we get from this? Even just as a cover, right, for civilian stuff. Naturally, these individuals were, as you know, quite, as we were saying before, also, say, but in between military and civilian activities. Slave trade entailed pretty violent management of the entire. Just think about the competition with the other Europeans, the risk of going out there, also in the midst of new areas that nobody had ever explored, and that required this constant repression, also of the natives and so on. So the sense that, again, these people were the best for the task was understood by a very cold, calculating, and also, let's say, saving-oriented, telling the truth. So somebody who would not apparently spend that much, but that, if convinced, would do so, even if it was just in case of a good idea, it was something that she would have reflected upon for a long time, such as Elizabeth. That definitely was of another temper, just by nature and character, but that, in fact, was not to command a fleet in person. She had to have cold blood to rule a kingdom, which she did pretty well, including in respect to this choice. Now, John Hawkins gained membership on the Navy Board as a consequence in 1577. helped no doubt also by his marriage to the daughter of Benjamin Gonson, the senior member of the Navy Board, who I think died on the same year. All right. Hawkins had extensive transoceanic experience, so this is another aspect in a broader, say, strategic, sort of even technical, of course, and logistic fashion, because one thing, as the old Navy Board thought, was to defend Britain. Another thing was to provide her with means that had to develop to the extent that this transoceanic activities had showed it was possible to do. So that's where the completely different mindset that would have never come from those members before was found. Hawkins had been a slaver along the African coast and had made 3 early voyages to the Americas already. His coat of arms, famously enough, has the black guy figuring on top. He had fought the Spanish in the Americas, as we were saying before. These guys were pirates fundamentally, and were in all kind of bloody business. He had preyed on the Spanish ships, which told him naturally what the Spaniards were made of, what say naval warfare was really about against that specific enemy for what would have become 8 years later the case here. He knew the high structured ships were definitely poor sailors and could not afford that mobility, that especially that risky of a strategic theater like the one that would have been materializing, because he believed war with Spain was coming, could provide in that he was right, and he had that kind of vision necessary to change things. Hawkins also believed that Spain could be crippled by a navy capable of sustained long-range operation, for a purpose here that was again not materialized yet in the Armada, but had to do with essentially severing Philip II from American gold and silver, which was a bit the big deal of the whole affair, especially for those who had been in the Americas and knew how things could be achieved there. After 1577, Hawkins waged a long, bitter struggle against the other board members to maintain the fleet more economically and invest in the savings in lower, narrower, better sailing ships with smaller crews. So it was not just about investment, but the awareness of where to invest successfully. All right, so again, funds were very scarce. Elizabeth could not provide for more without causing much greater problems to England. So these people had to sharpen their mind on the basis of their experience to remodeling, restructuring the Navy and widen it at the same time. The preference, as you understood already, was for these faster, more agile, more maneuverable ships that had to eventually harass what was thought to be a generally larger force, or at least one that could be essentially bogged down with this preparatory effort, combined with, as we've seen, the coastal defenses, etc. So this required just a broader understanding that just naval warfare. It had naturally to be thought out at this high levels, also with the monarch, etc. As it may seem incredible, Hawkins, that was supported by Elizabeth's chief advisor Burghley, at last won over the rest of the board, even after halting their embezzlement of naval funds, by the way. So these people were driven by thirst of power, etc., but there was definitely a broader meaning and purpose and vision behind this, as we noticed. This is how a new royal fleet began to take shape, with both new construction and much rebuilding, of course the existing ships as well, to give them however, the same low-build proportions of Hawkins' newer designs. Hawkins also pushed through the shift to heavier guns for the broadsides that was equally important. So, of course, it was a balance between rapidity and firepower, because, of course, you had to load more, but there weren't this kind of tower-like ships that were quite impractical for more complex maneuvers. The lapsed coastal fortification work of Henry VIII was also resumed in this process. Again, there was a vision about the integrated cooperation of coastal defenses and the fleet. Right, defenses for the principal Navy dockyard at Chatham on the Medway were strengthened. Besides Chatham, repairs and construction were also actively pursued at Woolwich and Deptford, that we have already seen were the main centers of arsenals and repair structures. The defense of the much more exposed facilities at Portsmouth were also improved further, although it was no longer the major fleet base. Dover had become more important as a base for the Channel patrols, at least since the loss of Calais, which of course had deprived the English of any base across the Channel. And Dover, as you know, is just in front of Calais. We can see it, and vice versa. During 1583-1584, the entrance to the Dover Harbor was deepened. So that would count, that I even made videos about English castles during the High Middle Ages, castle costs and so on, and as you can still beautifully see, Dover is one of the earliest fortifications on the Channel, from quite before, like the Norman times as well, but still with a steady implementation over the years. Accordingly, strategic thinking of the English Navy was changing. The legacy of Henry VIII's French wars was a very localized strategy. Right, when dominant, the English fleet would blockade the enemy fleet in its nearby cross-channel harbors and convoy English troops to the continent. As you know, Henry had been fighting on the continent together with Imperials against the French. We've seen how in 1545 the Royal Navy had tried to attack the French Navy in the Seine mouth. So that was mostly the concept. Having some local superiority, this was not possible, just skirmishing the enemy wearing it out at Similia. When invasion was imminent, the English fleet was to cruise the Channel defensively, based because they were habituated to that sense. Again, if we lose the fleet, it's a drag, and we simply eliminate for the enemy any nuisance, right, of trying to land with still a threat around. So they wouldn't engage, right, and they would try also to attack from different sides at some point, also to avert some other maneuvers, some other shippings to, as we've seen, other parts of Britain or Ireland. So the base up to that point to the westward had been Portsmouth to counter a Spanish threat, or mobilized at Chatham if the prospect was an attempt from France or the Netherlands, right? So directly an attack from the southeast. Furthermore, the fleet of Henry VIII was not long-range enough to operate offensively. Something different than what was starting now, that is to say, the English had been attacking the same Spanish coasts, right? And were creating quite a pain to Philip II in that sense, because it showed just the broader capacity of projection of the English fleet. And even though these were smaller operations compared to the ones of the scale of an invasion of a country like England, and the English potential at this point was known, also in that circumstance. These ships of that era could really stay at sea for only about 6 weeks before the crowding boat disease and the rations were consumed. So there were some limitations as well, at least intrinsic in Henry VIII's times ships. So what Hawkins worked for was innovating for obtaining greater operating ranges that naturally went beyond the mere ship design for example, better seaworthiness, that also was important in certain circumstances, such as strong sea, etc. Hawkins also continued experiments with lower manning ratios that he had begun in his earlier American voyages to optimize the storage and so just the operating range of fleets. Naturally, this entailed lots of other mechanisms on land. I mean, the reason why he could implement this innovations is that he had tested what it meant to cross the ocean at some point, and doing so with private means, and so stretching it to some limits that at a point a sovereign would have not risked for example, the royal ships in the first place. So he began to apply that acquired knowledge to a broader effect for the Navy. That was part of the problem. I mean, one thing is starting to say, okay, we need lots of ships, a lot of sailors, lots of guns, but then does anyone know how they actually operate altogether? What's the limit of, for example, resources, consumption, etc., how to improve this, etc. That's something that you must have gotten from somewhere else. And generally speaking, the government at that point didn't know better because they hadn't had an experience of that, nor the Navy itself was designed in the first place to perform certain roles that Hawkins was envisaging for it. But Hawkins succeeded dramatically. By 1585, Elizabeth and her advisors could include offensive naval strikes against Spain herself among their strategic options with much greater ease, right? And by this time, Hawkins and another rising naval personality of genius, Francis Drake, were strenuous in their support of such policy, because it meant also more funds, and so the possibility of earning more and prestige for themselves, their business, their clienteles, etc. There were, however, much bigger issues. This is just operational performance to a degree, right? All that lay behind the resources provided and also the acceptation of this bolder strategy depended on the Queen, of course. Elizabeth's perspective is crucial here. As we were saying before, she was just by nature and character much more conservative also in the conduct of the de facto war that now existed with Spain, because there was no actual declaration, as we've seen in the previous video, but the fact that that's where things had begun to be serious, right? Raiding northern Spain had definitely showed what just the English intentions were also on the European coasts, not just in the Americas by privateers, right? So there were big problems, as we already highlighted before. First of all, Ireland, from a political point of view, because The island was a power keg of Catholic discontent. It demanded continuous drain of resources to maintain the English garrison, and that didn't, as you know, even control historically the entirety of the island. I mean, it was not much of a deal, right, to keep the Irish down, but if these had been supported by Spain, if they had allowed a landing, things would have been much more complicated, right, for Dublin. A major English sortie towards Spain would remove, in a sense, the naval shield against Spanish landings in Ireland as well, right? So this was a legitimate concern, even may seem strange, but remember that at least the Habsburgic power bases were much closer than Spain, right? The Dutch revolt against Spanish rule in the Netherlands was, in fact, that main source of attention for Elizabeth, that was actively subsidizing the rebels, since the easiest route of invasion was definitely the Netherlands. We've seen it in the previous video, right? The Duke of Parma had estimated that 8-10 hours would have been sufficient, even with flat-bottomed vessels, to achieve surprise, eluding the English fleet and landing tens of thousands of men on English soil. Right, so that was really also a big deal, because in the Spanish plans, as we've seen, it wasn't ideal to launch an invasion of England from the Netherlands with the Dutch revolt going on. Plus, there was all the Dutch ships in the hands of the rebels that could still be retaken, right, to form a massive Spanish-Dutch fleet that, at that point, even the well-oiled English Royal Navy would have not stood a chance of coping with. Right, so Elizabeth was playing really dangerously here, but there was no other alternative to it, and all these policies cost. Right, the Irish garrisons, the Dutch subsidies, etc. Then too, England was not, again, an island, but just the southern half of one. The English fleet could theoretically bar invasion from all quarters, save England's land frontier with Scotland. I would like to stress this other aspect, that is, in naval warfare, blockades were practically impossible in large, say, even channels until the Victorian era. So landing is another matter here, because, as we just explained, it takes time, it's dangerous, etc. But you cannot quite prevent a fleet here to move unless around, say in this case, the British archipelago, unless you actually engage it. Right, so Scotland was big. It could definitely host an invasion army through her ports, so that this force would have just marched south to hopefully destroy the English army. Scotland was also a bit of a puzzle in of itself, because it was always swinging in balance between, first of all, the Catholic and the Protestant factions, right? Scotland, as you know, has a very complex history in that regard till the establishment of the union with England, at least in the early 18th century, for good. You would have still a kingdom, right? would remain with its army right at the northern border. Then there was a dynastic issue. The young Scottish King James VI, that was the estranged son of Elizabeth's long-term prisoner, Mary, Queen of Scotland, who also had a French Guise blood. The kid that, by the way, had a terrible youth. He also didn't really want to know his mother, that, as you know, was eventually executed by Elizabeth after she had fled Scotland to her cousin, Elizabeth herself, in fact, who, fearing for a possible Catholic revolt in England, took her out with great torment, because it was definitely not a very noble thing to do, unless a very serious threat and treason would have attempt to the Queen's life would have been acceptable. Elizabeth, as you know, risked to be assassinated on more than one occasion. She had a very, at some point, like most rulers at this time, a very unstable grip on the entire system, and especially this was the problem for everybody. They were all chronically short of money, right? And this Scotland up there was like Damocles' sword always looming over England, so that James VI, that, as you know, would become eventually king of the three kingdoms later on, was temporarily Elizabeth's ally. He was also receiving an English pension, by the way, and all in all, it was the heir to the same English throne, at least possibly, as he would actually be after Elizabeth's death. But what would Scotland do in all this if the Spanish had successfully landed there? Right, considering that Elizabeth had literally beheaded Mary, and so the mother of the current Scottish king. It was a minor and controlled, of course, by some Tudors that there were even less reliable in this sense as political figures. The same could happen, by the way, if the French, this is not just in the case of the Spanish invasion, but in the case of a French Catholic force, for example, reaching Scotland, as it had happened in 1545, in helping to get the Catholic upper hand on the Protestants in the country, and so becoming overtly against England, enemy of England. 6 times since 1543, French Catholic troops had been successfully convoyed to Scotland without English interception, right? So it was definitely easy. Like, all this preparation of the English navy could simply fail, like could simply be useless, right? Without even a fight, practically, if a large force had landed in Scotland unintercepted. France in the 80s had more important things to worry about than invading England, namely the wars of the religion. Like, France was essentially split in half because of the civil wars with a confessional meaning, background, motivation. However, the French crown was still powerful enough to exploit an English naval commitment elsewhere to land even like a relatively contained amount of troops that could help again turning tide in Scotland, or even supporting a neighbor in the enterprise, right? And again, especially the Catholic cause would have dramatically benefited from essentially what, especially in the case of a Spanish invasion, would have been Catholic, in fact, reestablishment in Britain as a whole, de facto the end of the Dutch revolt. So a completely different scenario in which surely the Habsburgs in Germany would have achieved substantial results against Protestantism, and so changing really powerfully the history of Europe, and especially in favor of the Catholic monarchy. As we must repeat, the most important problem for Elizabeth was the unsatisfactory financial resources. Right, this was really crippling overall. England was a modest power. It was not like of the same size of France or Spain. And the history of Elizabeth's decisions in the 1585-1588 period, when, of course, the Armada was now on the way, and she was aware of that, the debate revolving the naval policy and strategy to follow intensified dramatically, right? And this put the Queen in a very pressuring situation, not just because of the consequences of her choice, but the fact that the various factions that were very antagonistic with one another, so one, if you want, more conservative, less navally inclined, and another one more almost subversive to some, at least ideological degree, but very skilled in maritime warfare, were asking the Queen for greater amount of support, also financially, and this was adding to the difficulties of the sovereign in that context, and things, of course, would get shaken, dramatic, and dark, right, at the appearance of the Armada. But of course, these weren't the only people in the world having problems, as we highlighted on the video on the Spanish planning as well. So what I like when I make these videos is always highlighting the Clausewitzian awareness, not just of the laws of reciprocity, but the intensity, like the pressure that mounts whenever you have these strategically, say this scale of strategic commitment, because what is at stake is higher, but also difficulties increase, and they trigger the enemy to respond, adequately, right? So that the odds are very often balanced, also because these powers do not exist in a vacuum, and so everybody who is signing for one or the other, sympathizing, even just will try to help, right, both contenders, and flattening the odds even more, so making it practically a matter of draw, right, or at least, whenever the capacity of turning the tide will be. So we will see it better during the operations, the opening rounds of war, but the situation was much more critical than we, generally speaking, think, and from both sides, and so there is a lot of a lot of culture around these events, the historical period, the defining moments of all this enterprise, the imagery that remain in pop culture. But if you look at it, it was an incredibly daring enterprise for everybody involved, right? So this will surely get to the point we will look at all the various factors, and as it often happens in warfare, like you can't quite tell immediately or even forever, like what it's really going to happen, or but especially what even happened at the time, right? That people have this sort of know-it-all certainty about, well, it was this factor that made it. They're just making it up, because the truth is that they don't know it, because they don't understand strategy. And everybody who does knows what, with much greater precision, what were the factors that interplayed, but of course, just because of that, cannot define which is the decisive one. Because it's not even a matter of that climatic clash, it's also about like what you wanted to do with that, this confinement, say the limits of war into politics, and so things that without a bit of a military historical and strategically educational background, you can't quite fully grasp, right? So sometimes you're much more precise quantitatively and qualitatively by, of course, knowing that history is much, it's always about researching more and assessing that minimal thing that we think may have made the difference, that we already know it may have been the thing, is behind it even more complex than that. So it's not about knowing less or making relativism, as many historians say, oh, well, we cannot know. Well, we do know also pretty well what happened. But reading in the complexity of it is not for everyone, even for some historians, or most historians, very often. Well, in any case, for today I stop it here. We'll hopefully continue soon to speak of the Armada campaign. For today, however, I stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.